When Germany invaded the Netherlands on May 10, 1940, the Dutch Air Force was operating two modern fighter aircraft, the single-engine Fokker D-21 and the twin-engine Fokker G-1. Both were designed by the local Fokker company, and both were acquired by the Dutch Air Force as part of the same modernization program. But only one of these had astonished the world when it had been unveiled 4 years earlier at the 1936 Paris Air Show. In that edition of the famous aeronautical exhibition, many countries brought their best and most modern aircraft. The British showcased their Bristol Blenheim, Poland showed the PZL-23 and P-24 aircraft, Czechoslovakia presented the Letov S-528 biplane, and the Soviet Union brought something that was clearly going in the right direction, the Polikarpov TSKB-19. Naturally, the French came in full force and presented many aircraft, including some that would play a big part in World War II. However, the Dutch stand had the awe-inspiring Koolhoven FK-55, which ultimately never went beyond prototype, and the unique Fokker G-1. Just by the looks of them, it's easy to understand why the Dutch stand gathered much attention, especially with Germany, Italy and the US choosing not to bring any aircraft. This impact, however, wasn't just due to the G-1's spectacular twin-boom shape. The entire concept of a twin-engine fighter aircraft was rather innovative at that time. Referred to as destroyers, heavy fighters, or, in this case, a Jachtkreiser, these twin-engine fighters challenged conventional norms. As an example, the G-1's conception as a multi-role aircraft, a fighter, a bomber, and a reconnaissance aircraft all in one, was a significant departure from the prevailing strict adherence to specialized roles. The grand unveiling of the aircraft at the Paris exhibition attracted the interest of numerous countries. But at this point, the G-1 was still a long way from being ready. Its first flight would only happen 4 months later, on March 16, 1937. The first few flights weren't without problems, and some hiccups relating to the engines meant that Fokker had to play around with available choices until settling on the Bristol Mercury 8. This choice seems to be based on availability and uniformity, since this engine had already been chosen to be used in the Fokker D-21s of the Dutch Air Force. The armament was also standardized as 8 7.9mm FN Browning machine guns in the nose, instead of the initial plan of 2 23mm Madsen cannons and 2 light machine guns. After a period of negotiation, the Dutch Air Force placed an order for 36 G-1s in December 1937. These were delivered between November 1938 and October 1939. A date by which Germany had already invaded Poland, leading to the start of the Second World War. The Netherlands shared an extensive border with Germany, and the possibility of an invasion was quite present among the Dutch leadership. Still, the Dutch government insisted on a policy of neutrality, despite several warning signs. The invasion of Denmark and Norway on April 9, 1940 was one of such signs. But the most glaring one was a series of leaks by Oberst Hans Oster, deputy chief of the German Army's intelligence service, or Abwehr, and part of the internal resistance against the Nazi regime, who contacted Dutch intelligence detailing Operation Case Yellow, the planned invasion of France, Belgium and the Netherlands. For a variety of reasons, the Dutch government didn't believe Oster until it was too late. But, in the meantime, some members of the Dutch armed forces did prepare for a potential German invasion on their own initiative. That was the case for the Dutch Air Force, which acquired and deployed a very large number of AA guns and reinforced security around airfields. This, in particular, would prove very costly for the German Luftwaffe. Concerning the Netherlands, the German plan weighed heavily on the use of aircraft. The Dutch had created various defensive lines across the country, with one being of special importance, the water line. This line made use of a large number of canals and watercourses and defended the most populous part of the country, the so-called Vesting Holland, or Fortress Holland. The German plan had two main goals: achieving a foothold inside Fortress Holland and capturing the Dutch government, royal family and military leadership. These objectives were to be achieved by capturing key airfields with airborne troops, which would later be reinforced by airlift. In the Rotterdam area, 3 key bridges were to be seized and held until the 18th Army forced its way inside Fortress Holland, while the capture of Dutch leadership in the The Hague region would ensure a quick capitulation by Dutch forces. However, when Germany invaded the Netherlands on May 10, 1940, this didn't come as a total surprise. The day before, Hans Oster had warned the Dutch of the impending strike. This allowed the Dutch Air Force to be at a high level of readiness, with aircraft engines preheated and pilots ready to fly. Consequently, the first day of fighting in the air was extremely tough. Dutch pilots were taking off just as bombs were falling around them. When airborne, they found themselves in the midst of a large number of German bombers and transports, and were able to exact some revenge, only to be jumped upon by enemy fighters the next second. That day, the air war over the Netherlands seemed more like a pub brawl than anything else, and that allowed the Dutch pilots to use the superior maneuverability of their mounts to full effect. The Fokker G-1 proved to be especially maneuverable for a twin-engine aircraft. Normally, these were heavier and bulkier than their single-engine counterparts, and a common flaw was the lack of maneuverability. Its wing loading, a measure that can help us judge the level of maneuverability, was much lower than that of other contemporary heavy fighters, such as the German Bf-110, which was over 1,000 kilograms heavier. But what this maneuverability meant in practical terms was that many Dutch pilots relied on it to survive that first day. The chaotic nature of that air battle can be perfectly summarized by the contrasting fates of the two Fokker G-1 equipped squadrons. The 4th Fighter Squadron, based at Bergen Airfield, only managed to get one G-1 out of 12 in the air. Consequently, most were lost or heavily damaged on the ground, and apparently no victories were achieved. On the other hand, the 3rd Fighter Squadron based at Valhalla had considerably more success. The 11 G-1s on hand were able to achieve at least 11 victories, mostly bombers and transports, while losing only 2 of their number to enemy action. This artwork depicts these moments, and we can see First Lieutenant Peter Noppen flying G-1 312 and shooting at a trio of HE-111s over Valhaven, mere seconds after the German bombers had made a pass on that airfield. One of these was heavily damaged by Noppen's fire and was later finished off by another pilot. Despite some successes, by the end of the day, few Dutch fighter aircraft were untouched. Beyond those destroyed on the ground, many were crash-landed when Dutch pilots were unable to use the neutralized airfields. Regardless of the price, Germany had achieved air superiority over the Netherlands, and, from then on, the Dutch Air Force had to adopt a sort of guerrilla warfare. Operating from smaller airfields unknown to the Germans, the Dutch used what was called HBOB tactics, short for Houses Bompies Beasties, or Houses Trees and Animals, what pilots had to avoid while flying at such low altitudes. This allowed the Dutch Air Force to make some daring surprise attacks on German lines while escaping the attention of the ever-present German fighters. The Dutch also found some reinforcements by seizing a batch of undelivered G-1s ordered by the Finnish Air Force. These were G-1 Wasps, the only variant of the Dutch fighter, a smaller and lighter export version powered by Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines. A few saw combat, but this was a drop in the ocean. The Dutch Air Force could do little to alter the course of events, and, in the end, the German airborne troops were able to hold on to the bridges near Rotterdam long enough for the arrival of reinforcements. On May 14, Rotterdam was bombed in an effort to break the remaining resistance, which ultimately led to the Dutch surrendering after 5 days of intense combat. Despite being a strategic success, The campaign proved extremely costly for the German Air Force, with more than 450 aircraft put out of service in just 5 days. AA fire seems to account for more than half of those losses. In addition, the majority of those, about 280, were Juncker's Ju-52 transports that were destroyed on the ground or crash-landed in the chaos that followed the German airborne troops' failure to seize the airfields and subdue their air defenses. In fact, the second part of the German plan, the capture of Dutch leadership, was a total failure. It would take years to replace these losses in the transport fleet, and Germany felt it keenly during subsequent airlift operations like the one during the Battle of Stalingrad. Regarding our featured aircraft, Germany captured the few that were left and used them in training roles. During German occupation, the Fokker company was used to produce German aircraft and their parts, and after the war it turned to designing civil aircraft. Thus, this became the last Fokker fighter design produced in meaningful numbers. Unfortunately, it seems none survived the war, but if you would like to see one up close, you can visit the National Military Museum in Soesterberg near Utrecht, where they have this fantastic replica. Anyway, I would say that a small part of the G-1 survived in the unlikeliest manner. The G-1 had a highly innovative rotating conical rear turret that gave excellent coverage of the rear. The German Focke-Wulf company made a very similar looking aircraft, the FW-189 and its Werke turret. The FW-189 first flew in July 1938, years before the Germans would capture a Fokker G-1, but the G-1 had been unveiled quite publicly in Paris in November 1936. So, there is the possibility that the FW-189's turret was based on the Dutch one. But it can also be just a case of parallel development that reached the same results. For example, Czechoslovakia with its Praga E-51 prototype had also reached a very similar design in 1938 before being invaded by Germany. Plenty of other twin-engine fighters left a mark during the Second World War, including the similar-looking P-38. Do you have a favorite heavy fighter that you'd like to see covered on this channel? Let me know in the comments below. Remember to like and subscribe, and thank you very much for watching.